Alfred Griner Packer was born on January 21st, 1842, in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. Little is known about his early years, but records indicate that he worked as a shoemaker in his youth. In the early 1860s, Packer enlisted in the Union Army during the American Civil War. However, his military career was short-lived. He was discharged due to epilepsy, a condition that plagued him throughout his life. After his discharge, Packer ventured westward, seeking opportunities in the expanding American frontier. He tried his hand at prospecting, hoping to find fortune in the gold and silver rushes that drew many to the Western territories. Despite his ambitions, Packer struggled to establish a stable livelihood, often moving from one mining camp to another in search of better prospects. By the early 1870s, Packer found himself in Utah Territory, where he continued his pursuit of mineral wealth. It was during this period that he crossed paths with a group of prospectors planning an expedition into the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. This meeting would set the stage for a series of events that would forever link Alfred Packer's name with one of the most notorious episodes in the annals of the American West. In November of 1873, Alfred Packer joined a group of 21 prospectors in Provo, Utah. Their goal was to reach the gold fields of Breckenridge, Colorado, where they hoped to make their fortune. The expedition was led by Robert Bob McGrew, and the men were eager to strike it rich. However, their enthusiasm blinded them to the dangers of traveling through the Rocky Mountains as winter approached. The journey ahead would prove far more treacherous than they had anticipated. The group began their travels through the rugged terrain, but by early January of 1874, they found themselves struggling against the harsh conditions. The temperatures were brutally cold, the snow deep, and their supplies dwindling faster than expected. They had little experience navigating the unforgiving Colorado wilderness in the dead of winter. The group eventually reached the Ute encampment of Chief Ouray, near present-day Montrose, Colorado. Chief Ouray, known for his diplomatic efforts between Native Americans and white settlers, warned Packer and the others that attempting to cross the mountains in winter would be suicidal. The San Juan Mountains were infamous for their unpredictable weather, and heavy snowstorms had already made travel nearly impossible. He urged the men to wait until spring, offering them food and shelter to see them through the season. Some of the prospectors took the chief's advice seriously and decided to stay behind, understanding the risks involved. However, others, driven by desperation and greed, were determined to press forward. Despite the warning, on February 9th, 1874, Alfred Packer and 5 other men, Shannon Bell, James Humphrey, George Noon, Frank Miller, and Israel Swan, ignored Chief Ouray's advice and set out into the mountains. They believed they could reach the Los Pinos Indian Agency, a government outpost where they could restock their provisions and continue their search for gold. Packer, claiming to have knowledge of the terrain, acted as their guide, though in reality, he had little experience navigating such treacherous conditions. As they made their way through the snow-covered wilderness, the journey quickly turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The terrain was rugged, food supplies were nearly non-existent, and their progress was agonizingly slow. The men relied on what little they had, but hunger and exhaustion began taking their toll. Without adequate shelter, they were exposed to freezing temperatures, and starvation soon became a pressing concern. Weeks passed with no sign of civilization, and their situation became increasingly dire. Snowdrifts buried the landscape, making it nearly impossible to determine their location. The men likely suffered from frostbite and malnutrition, growing weaker with each passing day. Tempers flared, and the desperation of starvation began to settle in. What exactly happened during these weeks remains a mystery, but only one man, Alfred Packer, would emerge alive from the doomed expedition. By the time March of 1874 arrived, Alfred Packer and his 5 companions were deep within the San Juan Mountains, lost in a frozen wilderness that offered no escape. The The group had been traveling for weeks through relentless blizzards, their provisions long gone. Starvation was now a constant, gnawing agony. Their bodies weakened, their movements slowed, and the frigid temperatures only made survival more impossible. It was in this desperate state that the true horror of their journey unfolded. Packer later provided multiple, conflicting accounts of what happened next, making it difficult to determine the exact sequence of events. However, what is known is that by April of 1874, he was the only survivor. His initial story was that his companions had one by one perished from starvation or exposure, and he had been forced to eat their remains in order to survive. But over time, inconsistencies in his statements cast doubt on whether their deaths were natural, or if Packer himself had played a more sinister role. In his first version of events, Packer claimed that after exhausting all other means of survival, the men reluctantly turned to eating the flesh of their fallen comrades. He insisted that they had made a pact. Whoever died first would provide sustenance for the others. According to this account, Israel Swan, the oldest member of the group, was the first to perish. His body was consumed out of sheer necessity, and the pattern continued as the others succumbed to the elements one by one. Packer maintained that he had merely done what was necessary to stay alive. However, another version of his story painted a much darker picture. In this version, Packer described a violent struggle for survival. He claimed that Shannon Bell, one of the youngest and strongest members of the party, had gone mad with hunger and murdered the remaining men. Packer alleged that he had returned to camp one day to find Bell standing over the butchered remains of their companions, wielding a hatchet. In fear for his life, Packer claimed he was forced to kill Bell in self-defense. With no other option, he then resorted to consuming the bodies of the dead to survive. There was yet another version of his account that differed from the others entirely. In this telling, Packer admitted that hunger had driven him to commit murder. He confessed that after Swan had died naturally, he killed the others, one by one, in order to prolong his own survival. This admission, however, contradicted his earlier claims of self-defense and cast serious doubt on his credibility. Regardless of which version, if any, was the truth, one thing was certain. By the time Packer emerged from the mountains, he was alone, carrying with him items that had once belonged to his companions. His physical condition was shocking. He appeared well-fed and in relatively good health. Stark contrast to the state of starvation one would expect after such an ordeal. This raised immediate suspicion, as did his unwillingness to provide a consistent story about what had happened to the other men. After more than 2 months in the wilderness, Alfred Packer finally arrived at the Los Pinos Indian Agency in early April. He looked nothing like a man who had barely survived a brutal winter in the mountains. Though exhausted and weathered, he was far from emaciated. He carried a rifle that had belonged to Israel Swan, as well as a knife and other possessions from the deceased men. The authorities at Los Pinos took note of this and immediately found his story questionable. At first, Packer claimed that he had been left behind when the rest of the group continued on, and that he had no knowledge of their fates. But as officials pressed him for details, he stumbled over his own lies, unable to keep his account straight. His erratic behavior and possession of his companions' belongings were damning. It wasn't long before suspicions turned into accusations. As word of his arrival spread, surviving members of the original prospecting party, the men who had wisely stayed behind at Chief Ure's camp, arrived at Los Pinos. They were shocked to see Packer, and even more disturbed when they noticed he was carrying items that had belonged to the supposedly deceased men. Confronted with their suspicions, Packer struggled to explain himself, offering yet another version of events that only deepened the growing doubts about his innocence. It was becoming clear to everyone. Packer knew far more than he was letting on, and soon the truth would begin to unravel in the most horrifying way possible. As Alfred Packer lingered at the Los Pinos Indian Agency, His inconsistent stories and suspicious behavior only fueled the growing doubts about his innocence. The surviving prospectors who had stayed behind at Chief Oray's camp were particularly disturbed by Packer's appearance and the possessions he carried. They knew the missing men had been well equipped when they left for the mountains. Yet, Packer had returned alone, suspiciously well-fed, and in possession of their belongings. These concerns were relayed to General Charles Adams, an agent overseeing affairs at Los Pinos, who decided to investigate further. Realizing that his story was crumbling under scrutiny, Packer made another attempt to explain himself. This time, he claimed that he had set out on his own after being abandoned by the others. He insisted that he had survived by eating what little provisions he had left, and by resorting to cannibalism only after discovering the frozen bodies of his companions. However, his shifting narratives had already cast doubt on his credibility, and Adams was not convinced. Determined to uncover the truth, Adams sent a search party into the San Juan Mountains to locate the remains of Packer's fellow travelers. The search took months, as the terrain was treacherous, and the heavy snowfall made it difficult to navigate. However, in early August of 1874, a horrifying discovery was made. The bodies of the missing men were found in a remote mountain valley near present-day Lake City, Colorado. What investigators saw confirmed their worst fears. The scene suggested something far more sinister than a group of men simply succumbing to starvation. The remains of Israel Swan, Frank Miller, George Noon, James Humphrey, and Shannon Bell were scattered across the site, partially decomposed, but still revealing signs of foul play. It was immediately clear that they had not all died of natural causes. Many of the bodies showed evidence of blunt force trauma and deep wounds, consistent with hatchet strikes. One of the most disturbing details was that Shannon Bell's body had a gunshot wound to the pelvis, suggesting he had not died from starvation or exposure, but had instead been shot. These gruesome findings directly contradicted Packer's claims that his companions had simply wasted away in the brutal winter cold. Even more damning was the fact that the bodies appeared to have been butchered. Flesh had been removed in a manner consistent with systematic cutting, rather than haphazard scavenging by animals. The careful removal of muscle tissue from certain areas suggested a methodical approach, something done by human hands, not the result of random decomposition or wildlife activity. Investigators quickly concluded that Packer had not merely stumbled upon the remains of his companions, but had deliberately killed at least some of them in order to sustain himself. With this evidence, General Adams confronted Packer directly, pressing him for the truth. At first, Packer continued to deny any wrongdoing, but faced with the reality that the bodies had been found, he finally broke down and provided yet another version of events, one that differed from every previous account he had given. This time, he admitted that the men had died one by one, but he blamed Shannon Bell for their deaths. According to Packer, Bell had lost his mind from hunger and had killed the others in a frenzy. Packer claimed that he had returned to camp one day to find Bell standing over the mutilated bodies of the others. Fearing for his own life, Packer said he had shot Bell in self-defense, leaving him as the sole survivor. Despite this partial confession, authorities were not convinced. Too many elements of his story failed to align with the evidence at the crime scene. For one, if Bell had killed the others, why was it Packer who was found carrying their possessions? And why did the condition of the bodies suggest calculated butchery rather than chaotic violence? With overwhelming evidence against him, Alfred Packer was officially arrested and charged with murder. He was held at Saguache, Colorado, where he awaited trial. However, before he could face justice, Packer managed to escape from jail in the summer of 1874. Disappearing into the vast American frontier, he successfully evaded capture for nearly 9 years. During this time, stories of the so-called Colorado Cannibal spread across the country. Some saw Packer as a ruthless killer who had betrayed his companions, while others viewed him as a man who had done what was necessary to survive. Regardless of where public opinion fell, his sudden disappearance only added to his legend. It would take almost a decade before authorities finally caught up with him. In March of 1883, a man named Jean French, who had been a member of the original prospecting party, spotted Packer living under the alias John Schwartze in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Recognizing him immediately, French alerted the authorities, and Packer was soon arrested once again. This time, there would be no escape. He would finally stand trial for what had happened in the San Juan Mountains. After nearly 9 years on the run, Alfred Packer was finally back in custody. Authorities transported him to Lake City, Colorado, where he would stand trial for the murder of his 5 companions. The public was eager for justice, and newspapers sensationalized the case, portraying Packer as a cold-blooded murderer who had slaughtered his fellow prospectors for his own survival. Packer's trial began in April of 1883 at the Hinsdale County Courthouse in Lake City. He was charged with the premeditated murder of Israel Swan, who was believed to be the first of the 5 men to die. The prosecution argued that Packer had not only killed Swan, but had gone on to methodically murder the remaining members of the group, using their bodies for food while continuing his journey through the mountains. Key witnesses included members of the original prospecting party who had remained at Chief Oray's camp. They testified about Packer's suspicious return, his spending spree with money and belongings that had clearly belonged to the victims, and his ever-changing stories about what had happened. The most damning evidence, however, was the discovery of the mutilated bodies in the mountains, which strongly suggested they had been deliberately butchered. Packer maintained his innocence, claiming once again that he had only killed Shannon Bell in self-defense, and had resorted to cannibalism solely as a means of survival. However, his multiple inconsistent confessions made it difficult for the jury to believe him. After a brief deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of premeditated murder. Judge Melville Jerry delivered a harsh sentence, reportedly telling Packer, "There were only 7 Democrats in Hinsdale County, and you ate 5 of them." While the accuracy of this quote remains debated, the sentiment was clear. Packer was sentenced to death by hanging. Packer's legal troubles were far from over. His defense team quickly appealed the conviction, arguing that the laws under which he was sentenced had not been in effect at the time of the crime. In October of 1885, the Colorado Supreme Court overturned his conviction on procedural grounds, ruling that Packer could not be executed. Instead of being set free, however, Packer was retried in the Gunnison, Colorado, in June of 1886. This time, the charge was reduced to manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. The prosecution presented the same evidence, and Packer again insisted that he had only killed Bell in self-defense. Though the jury found him guilty, they recognized mitigating circumstances and sentenced him to 40 years in prison, 5 consecutive terms of 8 years, 1 for each victim. At the time, it was the longest prison sentence ever handed down in Colorado. Packer served his time at the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City. Even behind bars, he remained a controversial figure. Some saw him as a remorseless murderer who had betrayed his companions, while others viewed him as an unfortunate man who had done what he needed to survive. As the years passed, public opinion began to shift. Some people, including journalists and politicians, questioned whether Packer had received a fair trial. The lack of concrete evidence showing exactly how the 5 men had died left room for doubt. Many believed that the harsh sentence had been influenced more by public outrage than by clear legal reasoning. These concerns eventually led to a push for clemency. Supporters, including Denver Post journalist Polly Pry, campaigned for Packer's release, arguing that he had already served a significant portion of his sentence and that he was not the monster he had been made out to be. In 1899, after serving nearly 18 years, Packer was granted parole by Colorado Governor Charles Thomas. After his release, Packer lived a relatively quiet life. working as a guard at the Denver Post and occasionally giving interviews about his infamous past. He never strayed far from the public eye, as his case remained a source of fascination. He continued to insist that he had only killed in self-defense and had not deliberately murdered his companions for food. On April 23, 1907, Alfred Packer died at the age of 65. He was buried in Littleton, Colorado, in the Prince Avenue Cemetery. Even in death, his story remained a topic of debate. Some saw him as a ruthless killer, while others believed he was simply a desperate man trapped in a brutal survival scenario. More than a century after his death, Alfred Packer remains one of the most infamous figures in American history. His case continues to be studied by historians, legal scholars, and true crime enthusiasts. His name is often associated with the dark realities of survival cannibalism, a subject that has fascinated and horrified people for generations. Packer's story has inspired books, films, and even a dark-humored musical, Cannibal, the musical, created by Trey Parker before he became famous for South Park. The University of Colorado Boulder even named their cafeteria after him, the Alfred Packer Grill, a tongue-in-cheek tribute to the state's most notorious cannibal. Yet, beyond the pop culture references, his case also serves as a reminder of the harsh and unforgiving conditions of the American frontier. Whether he was a ruthless murderer or an unfortunate survivor, Alfred Packer's story remains one of the most chilling and mysterious in the annals of true crime. In Colorado, the name Scott Kimball is often spoken in whispers. He is one of the most notorious criminals in the state's history, known for his chilling actions that still haunt the community today. His story is a twisted tale of manipulation, deceit, and murder that began in the early 2000s. Kimball's life seemed relatively ordinary on the surface. Born in 1969, he was charismatic and well-liked by many. However, beneath this facade, there were signs of troubling behavior. He was known for being charming, but also for having a dark side, struggling with authority, and getting into trouble as he grew older. His early life was marked by instability, with his parents divorcing when he was a teenager. These personal struggles seemed to shape him, fueling a growing anger and need for control. As an adult, Kimball found a way to blend into society. He worked as an FBI informant, which gave him access to sensitive information. However, it was during his time with the FBI that the seeds for his dark journey were planted. Kimball used his position to further his own interests and deceive those around him. It was a role that gave him the perfect cover, allowing him to commit crimes while staying under the radar. In 2003, Kimball's true nature began to reveal itself. He kidnapped and murdered Jennifer Markham, a 25-year-old woman who was a mother of two. Jennifer's tragic death was only the beginning. Kimball's actions were cold and calculating, and he went on to kill at least 3 more people, including his own uncle. The investigation into these murders was slow to develop, and for a time it seemed that Kimball was untouchable. Kimball's crimes were not just brutal, they were cunning. He left behind a trail of clues, but they were often misleading, making it difficult for authorities to connect the dots. The investigation was complex, with detectives trying to piece together the puzzle of Kimball's actions. But as the bodies piled up, one thing became clear. There was a monster living among the people of Colorado. As the investigation continued, fear spread through the community. The idea that someone could commit such heinous acts while blending in with society was chilling. People were left wondering how someone so dangerous could go unnoticed for so long, and how many more victims he would claim before he was stopped. As authorities continued to unravel the disturbing trail left by Scott Kimball, they started to uncover the true extent of his manipulation. His charm and intelligence had allowed him to live in plain sight, making it even harder for investigators to connect him to the growing list of crimes. But as more victims were discovered, Kimball's web of lies began to unravel. In 2004, Kimball's killing spree escalated, and his methods grew more sinister. At this point, authorities knew they were dealing with someone who was not just a murderer, but a master manipulator. He used his role as an FBI informant to cover his tracks, which is what allowed him to stay under the radar for so long. The fear that had gripped the community now grew into a sense of urgency as detectives tried to piece together the timeline of his horrific actions. The most chilling part of Kimball's criminal history is the way he was able to gain the trust of people he later betrayed. His ability to deceive and manipulate those around him was unmatched, allowing him to blend in with various communities, including his family. His uncle, a close relative, would eventually become one of Kimball's victims. Kimball's coldness and ability to betray those closest to him only added to the fear surrounding his crimes. It was clear that no one was safe from his reach. Authorities also learned that Kimball had a dangerous obsession with control. He didn't just kill his victims. He dominated their lives in ways that were hard for anyone to fully understand. He used the trust of those around him to further his own agenda, leaving behind a trail of fear and unanswered questions. As the investigation into Kimball's actions continued, investigators found themselves constantly asking, how did he evade capture for so long? It seemed as though every time they got close to solving the mystery, he would slip away, leaving more victims in his wake. It was this elusiveness that made the case so difficult to solve and fueled the growing dread in the community. While investigators were busy piecing together the clues, they were also left with an unsettling feeling. Was this man capable of more? What other dark secrets was he hiding? The investigation became a race against time, with the authorities struggling to catch up to a criminal who was always one step ahead. Kimball's ability to manipulate the system and evade capture was terrifying. The deeper authorities dug into his life, the more questions arose. How could someone so seemingly ordinary commit such horrific acts while maintaining a facade of normalcy? As time passed, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, but the sense of unease lingered. The question remained, when would Scott Lee Kimball finally be stopped? By 2006, the investigation into Scott Lee Kimball had reached a crucial turning point. After years of evading authorities, he was finally arrested. But the arrest was not the end of the chilling tale. It was merely the beginning of uncovering the full extent of his crimes. The public had been left in the dark for years, unable to grasp how someone like Kimball could operate for so long without being caught. As detectives began to piece together the evidence, they discovered a horrifying truth. Kimball was not acting alone. He had found ways to exploit the trust of the people around him, leaving behind a series of unsolved cases and families desperate for answers. The investigation into Kimball's activities revealed that he had a deep knowledge of criminal behavior, which he used to his advantage. As an FBI informant, he had access to information and resources that allowed him to stay one step ahead of the authorities. This role had given him a sense of authority and power, and he exploited it to commit heinous crimes without suspicion. It became clear that Kimball had used his position to manipulate the investigation, making it even more difficult for authorities to track him down. The case took a darker turn when authorities began to look into the circumstances surrounding Kimball's past. His earlier life was marked by instability and violence. He had a history of criminal behavior, but somehow it was overlooked. It seemed as though his charm and ability to fit into various circles had allowed him to evade detection for years. His criminal record was a patchwork of minor offenses, but these were overshadowed by the horrific crimes that would come to define his legacy. As the investigation continued, authorities uncovered a chilling pattern in Kimball's behavior. He seemed to target vulnerable individuals, using his charisma to gain their trust before betraying them in the most horrific ways. His methods were calculated and precise, often leaving little to no evidence behind. It was as though Kimball was a master of blending in, making it nearly impossible for anyone to see the monster hiding beneath the surface. Kimball's ability to manipulate people and situations made him even more dangerous. He preyed on those who were either trusting or unsuspecting, using his position as an informant to hide his true intentions. As the investigation unfolded, it became evident that he was not just a killer, but a skilled manipulator who had evaded capture for far too long. The more detectives uncovered, the more they realized how deeply he had embedded himself into the lives of his victims, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. Despite his arrest, the question of whether he had more victims continued to haunt investigators. Was Kimball responsible for even more deaths, or had his reign of terror finally come to an end? The fear that had plagued the community for years was not easily dispelled, and even behind bars, Kimball remained a figure of unease. As the legal proceedings began, the dark mystery surrounding his past only deepened. As the legal proceedings against Scott Kimball unfolded, the public was both horrified and captivated by the details of his crimes. By 2007, Kimball's trial had begun, drawing intense media attention. The courtroom was filled with tension as victims' families waited for justice, while Kimball sat with his usual calm demeanor, seemingly unaffected by the gravity of his actions. The prosecution presented a case that detailed his manipulation, his history of criminal behavior, and the chilling acts he had committed. But despite the overwhelming evidence, there was a dramatic twist. Kimball's defense argued that he was not mentally competent to stand trial. The defense team painted a picture of a man struggling with psychological issues, questioning his ability to fully comprehend the charges against him. This added a layer of complexity to the trial, with Kimball's mental state becoming a central issue. The court had to determine whether he was capable of understanding the proceedings and whether he could be held accountable for the crimes he had committed. This defense strategy stretched the trial out, prolonging the uncertainty for both the victims' families and the community, who had waited so long for justice. Despite the defense's attempts to shift the blame onto Kimball's mental health, the prosecution was relentless in their pursuit of justice. They highlighted his years of deceit, his history as an FBI informant, and the sophisticated methods he had used to evade capture. It was clear that Kimball had carefully planned his crimes, using his knowledge of law enforcement to stay one step ahead. He had manipulated the system and the people around him, all while continuing his deadly spree. By 2009, the trial reached its conclusion, and the jury rendered a verdict. Scott Kimball was found guilty of multiple murders, including the death of Jennifer Markham. The sentencing hearing that followed was a moment of reckoning for the victims' families, who had endured years of pain, not knowing if they would ever see justice served. Kimball was sentenced to 70 years in federal prison, a sentence that would ensure he would never again walk free. The courtroom was filled with a sense of relief, but the scars of his actions remained. However, the legal victory did not bring closure to all the unanswered questions surrounding Kimball's crimes. As the investigation continued, there were whispers that he may have been involved in even more murders. The authorities found it difficult to conclusively link him to other cold cases, but there were clear indications that his manipulation of the system had allowed him to avoid detection for much longer than anyone had anticipated. The public's fear of Kimball did not end with his conviction. Many wondered if there were other individuals who had helped him, or if there were more victims whose cases had not yet been solved. The fact that he had operated under the radar for so long made it difficult to trust that the full extent of his crimes had been uncovered. As the years passed, some even speculated that Kimball might still be pulling the strings from behind bars, orchestrating crimes, or manipulating people in ways that were not immediately obvious. Though Kimball was behind bars, the chilling question of whether he had accomplices or whether he would ever reveal the full extent of his crimes continued to haunt the investigation. His trial may have concluded, but the darkness surrounding his actions was far from over. The mystery of Scott Kimball's reign of terror was not easily solved, and the fear he instilled in the public remained palpable, even as the years passed. As Scott Kimball serves his 70-year sentence, the full extent of his reign of terror continues to reverberate through Colorado. While the authorities were able to close several cases with his conviction, the true number of his victims remains uncertain. The possibility that there are still unsolved cases tied to Kimball lingers in the minds of both investigators and the families of missing persons. His ability to manipulate the system, his history with the law enforcement, and his complex web of deceit make it incredibly difficult to know if all of his crimes have been brought to light. One of the most unsettling aspects of Kimball's case is the question of how he was able to operate under the radar for so long. As an FBI informant, he had a unique ability to blend in and exploit his position, using his knowledge of criminal investigations to his advantage. This, combined with his manipulative and calculating nature, allowed him to evade detection for years, leading many to believe that even now, there are still victims whose cases have not been fully resolved. Kimball's legacy is one of terror and manipulation, but it also serves as a warning to the public and law enforcement alike. His case is a stark reminder of how even those in positions of power and trust can exploit the system for their own benefit, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The fact that Kimball was able to manipulate both his colleagues and the criminal justice system underscores the importance of vigilance and accountability in the pursuit of justice. As time moves on, Scott Kimball remains behind bars, but his story is far from over. The impact of his crimes continues to ripple through the community, with questions that may never be fully answered. While his conviction has provided some closure for the families of his known victims, the truth about the full scope of his actions may never be fully realized. The investigation into Kimball's past is ongoing, and some believe that there may still be other victims who have yet to be identified. In the end, Scott Kimball's story is one of darkness, manipulation, and tragedy. His crimes have left an indelible mark on the state of Colorado, and the mystery surrounding his actions continues to haunt those who lived through it. As we reflect on his case, it serves as a reminder of the complexities of criminal investigations and the need for constant vigilance in the pursuit of justice. Thank you for following this journey through the chilling and disturbing story of Scott Kimball. While justice has been served for some, the shadows of his actions will likely linger for years to come. Kelsie Schelling, a bright and ambitious 21-year-old from Denver, Colorado, seemed to have her whole life ahead of her. In February of 2013, she was living in Denver and studying at the University of Colorado. On February 4th, Kelsie disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and her case soon became one of the most haunting missing persons cases in recent years. Kelsie had been in a relationship with a man named Santana Combs, whom she had known for a while. They had been dating off and on, and though there were some concerns from Kelsie's family about the relationship, nothing had ever suggested that something was terribly wrong. However, things would soon take a very dark turn. The night she vanished, Kelsie had driven to Pueblo, Colorado to visit Santana, who was staying with his cousin. Before leaving, Kelsie told her family that she was planning to meet with him and would return later that evening. She left behind her cell phone, which would later reveal key information about her movements that night. It wasn't long after Kelsie arrived in Pueblo that she sent a text message to her friend, stating that she had arrived safely. However, hours later, she would go completely silent. Kelsie's family grew concerned as they tried to reach her, but they received no response. Kelsie had last been in contact with Santana before her phone went dead, and she was never heard from again. The following day, Kelsie's family, worried sick, reported her missing. They immediately began trying to get information, but the investigation soon revealed that there were many things about Kelsie's disappearance that didn't add up. February 5th, 2013, marked the beginning of an extensive search that would soon unravel a tangled web of secrets. For Kelsie's loved ones, the feeling of uncertainty was unbearable. What had happened to her? Why hadn't she been in touch? The authorities began combing through every piece of evidence they could find. Kelsie's car was found in a parking lot near the Pueblo Mall on February 7th, 2013. The discovery of the car raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of Kelsie, and her belongings appeared to be untouched. Surveillance footage from the parking lot showed Kelsie walking towards a building with Santana, but it seemed as if she had vanished into thin air afterward. As the investigation unfolded, police started to focus on Santana Combs. He was the last person known to have been with Kelsie. However, his story kept changing, and police began to question his involvement. Santana claimed he had dropped Kelsie off at a nearby Walmart after their meeting, but there was no clear evidence to support his story. Investigators soon discovered that Santana had been hiding key details about what had really happened the night Kelsie vanished. In the hours and days that followed Kelsie's disappearance, investigators struggled to gather concrete evidence. Her family and friends held on to the hope that she might be found alive, but as time passed, the mystery deepened, and the fear that something terrible had happened to her grew. Kelsie's disappearance sent shockwaves through her community and drew national attention. Her family's desperate search for answers continued, but the only thing they had for sure was that the young woman they knew had vanished without a trace, and the police were left piecing together a puzzle with too many missing pieces. As the search efforts continued, Kelsie's family began to question whether they would ever get the truth about what happened to their daughter. As the investigation into Kelsie Schelling's disappearance deepened, the days turned into weeks, and her family's hope for a quick resolution began to fade. The search for answers grew more urgent, with the authorities focusing their efforts on retracing Kelsie's final moments and attempting to make sense of the information they had. Kelsie's car, found abandoned near the Pueblo Mall on February 7th, 2013, had been left locked, with the keys still inside. The car was parked in a spot where surveillance cameras had captured Kelsie's last known movements. These cameras showed Kelsie walking towards a building, accompanied by Santana Combs, but from that point on, the footage stopped. The lack of evidence from the car was troubling, as it suggested that Kelsie had not left the area willingly, and her disappearance didn't seem to follow any predictable pattern. The investigation soon centered on Kelsie's relationship with Santana Combs. As the last person to have seen her, his role in the case came under intense scrutiny. Initially, Santana told police that he had driven Kelsie to the Walmart parking lot in Pueblo after they met, but his story was inconsistent. His initial statement, which was later contradicted by the evidence, claimed he had left her there alone. However, surveillance footage from the Walmart parking lot showed no sign of Kelsie, and police were left with more questions than answers. In the weeks following Kelsie's disappearance, investigators began uncovering discrepancies in Santana's account of that night. His cell phone records became a crucial part of the investigation. The records showed that Santana's phone had pinged near the area where Kelsie's car was discovered, but when police attempted to press him for more details, his statements seemed evasive and unclear. This raised suspicions about his involvement, but there was still no concrete proof linking him directly to Kelsie's disappearance. As the investigation continued, police began to explore the possibility that Kelsie's disappearance might have been linked to foul play. They looked into Santana's background and discovered that he had a history of criminal behavior, including past arrests for various offenses. Despite this, there was still no definitive proof that Santana was directly involved in Kelsie's case. The lack of physical evidence made it difficult to build a solid case against him, but law enforcement remained focused on him as a prime suspect. In addition to investigating Santana, authorities reached out to Kelsie's friends and family for more insight into her life and possible relationships that could have played a role in her disappearance. Kelsie's mother, Laura Schelling, was vocal about the need for justice and quickly became an advocate for her daughter. She worked tirelessly, speaking with the media and urging the public to come forward with any information. Her determination helped to keep Kelsie's case in the public eye, and eventually, it would lead to new developments in the investigation. During this time, the police received several tips, but none of them provided the breakthrough they were hoping for. It was not until March of 2013, nearly 2 months after Kelsie's disappearance, that the investigation began to gain momentum again. A new lead surfaced, pointing to a potential location where Kelsie's remains might be found. This lead would set off a series of events that would eventually bring the case closer to resolution. But for now, the mystery surrounding Kelsie's disappearance remained unsolved. Kelsie's family, especially her mother, continued to push forward, determined to find answers. Laura Schelling's public campaign for information helped to raise awareness about her daughter's case and place pressure on law enforcement to pursue every lead. However, even as the case gained national attention, the trail remained cold, leaving everyone involved in the investigation to grapple with the question, where was Kelsie Schelling? As days turned into months, the search for Kelsie seemed to grow more desperate. The only certainty was that the investigation was far from over, and everyone involved was committed to finding the truth. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but Kelsie's family remained steadfast in their hope that justice would eventually be served. As the investigation into Kelsie Schelling's disappearance continued, law enforcement faced growing pressure to make progress. Weeks turned into months, and the mystery surrounding her case deepened. With no new evidence emerging and few solid leads, investigators were left to comb through every detail of Kelsie's life in hopes of uncovering a clue that would bring them closer to the truth. The pivotal moment came in March of 2013, when a significant breakthrough in the case occurred. Investigators received a tip about a vehicle that had been seen in the area where Kelsie's car had been abandoned. This vehicle had been observed near the Pueblo Mall in the days following Kelsie's disappearance, and its connection to the case seemed worth investigating. It was not long before the car was traced back to Santana Combs, the man who had been with Kelsie on the night she disappeared. The discovery of his involvement raised more questions and led detectives to re-examine his actions in the hours following Kelsie's vanishing. Further investigation into Santana's actions revealed even more concerning details. His cell phone records indicated that he had made several calls and sent text messages in the hours after Kelsie's disappearance. These communications, however, did little to clarify his role in the case. While they were suspicious, there was no conclusive evidence that directly linked Santana to Kelsie's fate. The lack of physical evidence and Santana's contradictory statements only added to the confusion, making it increasingly difficult for detectives to piece together a clear timeline of events. Despite these challenges, law enforcement was determined to continue their search for clues. A search of the area around the Pueblo Mall and the parking lot where Kelsie's car had been found yielded little. There were no signs of foul play or any physical evidence that could directly lead them to Kelsie. However, a thorough search of Santana's vehicle and home, as well as additional interviews with people close to Kelsie, began to paint a more troubling picture. These investigations revealed that Santana had become more evasive and uncooperative as time went on. His behavior raised red flags, especially since he had been the last person to see Kelsie. In the meantime, Kelsie's family, particularly her mother, Laura Schelling, continued to tirelessly advocate for answers. Laura organized community searches, worked closely with law enforcement, and kept Kelsie's case in the public eye. Her persistence, coupled with the growing media coverage, helped keep the case alive in the minds of the public. Laura's relentless pursuit of justice ensured that Kelsie's story was not forgotten, even as the investigation seemed to stall. While the search for Kelsie remained ongoing, her disappearance sparked conversations about safety, relationships, and the complexities of missing persons cases. In the months following Kelsie's vanishing, more people came forward with tips, and the investigation slowly gained momentum. Yet, the case remained frustratingly unsolved. Investigators had not yet found any physical evidence that could confirm Kelsie's whereabouts, and Santana's involvement remained unclear. Kelsie's case was complicated by the lack of direct evidence, the inconsistencies in Santana's statements, and the vast amount of time that had passed since her disappearance. but detectives continued to dig into the details, exploring every possible lead. They were determined to bring closure to Kelsie's family, even though they knew the road ahead would not be easy. As summer approached in 2013, the case seemed to have hit a wall. There were still no signs of Kelsie, and her family was left to cope with the emotional toll of the ongoing uncertainty. But amidst the frustration, there was still hope. Law enforcement's determination to solve the case remained unwavering, and the search for Kelsie continued. Little did anyone know that the next few months would bring new developments that would shake the case wide open. The investigation into Kelsie Schelling's disappearance took a critical turn in the latter part of 2013. By now, the case had captured national attention, and the search for Kelsie seemed to be at a standstill. Law enforcement had spent months following leads and examining the actions of key individuals connected to Kelsie's life, but there were still no definitive answers. However, in November of 2013, new evidence emerged that gave investigators hope. Detectives received a key tip that led them to re-examine the surveillance footage from around the Pueblo Mall area. For the first time, investigators were able to establish a more precise timeline of events surrounding Kelsie's disappearance. Surveillance footage from various locations in Pueblo provided critical insights, showing that Kelsie had been in contact with someone after she left the Walmart parking lot. This footage, coupled with Kelsie's last known communications, raised new questions about who she had been with during the hours after she vanished. The footage also showed Kelsie driving toward the area where her car would later be found, but it was unclear whether she had been alone at the time. As detectives continued to piece together the evidence, they turned their focus back to Santana Combs. With the footage in hand, investigators began to scrutinize his actions more closely, searching for any connections that could explain his involvement in Kelsie's disappearance. In December of 2013, a major breakthrough occurred. Santana was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in connection with Kelsie's death. The arrest came after the discovery of new evidence that suggested his direct involvement in her disappearance. The arrest was a significant turning point in the investigation, but it raised even more questions. Why had Santana initially denied any involvement? What had happened between him and Kelsie that night? As authorities continued their investigation, more details about Santana's relationship with Kelsie began to surface. Investigators learned that the two had been dating, but their relationship had been marked by tension and disagreements. Santana's actions in the days following Kelsie's disappearance had been highly suspicious, and the evidence that linked him to her case was damning. Despite the arrest, the investigation did not end there. As detectives continued to search for Kelsie's body, they hoped to find more evidence that could explain how she had died. They focused their search on the Pueblo area, where Kelsie's car had been found, hoping to find new clues that could provide the answers her family desperately sought. The case, now high profile, also began to receive more media attention, with national news outlets covering the developments surrounding Kelsie's disappearance and Santana's arrest. Throughout this period, Kelsie's family remained committed to finding out what had happened to their loved one. Kelsie's mother worked tirelessly to keep her daughter's case in the public eye. She advocated for continued searches and supported law enforcement's efforts to bring Kelsie home. In the months following Santana's arrest, Laura and the rest of Kelsie's family remained hopeful that they would soon find out what had really happened. While the arrest of Santana Combs marked a major milestone in the case, it did not bring closure to Kelsie's family. They continued to grieve their loss, hoping that the truth would finally come to light. The investigation was far from over, and law enforcement was committed to finding all the answers, including discovering the exact circumstances surrounding Kelsie's death. Despite the challenging and painful journey ahead, Kelsie's family remained resolute, determined to see justice served. As the months passed, the case continued to evolve. Evidence slowly came together, and the investigation delved deeper into the truth behind Kelsie's final hours. Although the arrest of Santana was a significant development, The search for Kelsie's body and the exact circumstances of her death were still paramount to investigators. The investigation into Kelsie's disappearance had already been long and complicated, but the hope remained that one day they would have all the answers they so desperately needed. By early 2014, the case of Kelsie Schelling had garnered widespread attention, and her family's fight for justice was gaining momentum. Santana Combs, the man arrested in connection with Kelsie's disappearance, was facing serious charges, but the true story behind Kelsie's death remained unclear. Although some pieces of evidence had come to light, investigators and Kelsie's family knew that they needed more to fully understand what had happened to her. The mystery surrounding her death hung over everyone involved in the case, and the pressure to uncover the truth was intensifying. In August of 2015, the search for Kelsie's body took a dramatic turn when investigators received new leads pointing to a location near the Pueblo Reservoir. The authorities had suspected for months that Kelsie's body might be hidden somewhere near the city of Pueblo, but they lacked the evidence to narrow down the search area. With the new information, the authorities organized another search, hoping to finally bring some closure to the case. Unfortunately, the search for Kelsie's remains at the Pueblo Reservoir did not yield any results. As the investigation into Kelsie's disappearance continued, investigators were also focused on Santana's trial. He had been charged with first-degree murder, and the trial was set to begin in late 2015. The prosecution presented evidence that suggested Santana had been involved in Kelsie's death, though they still did not have the exact details of how she had died. The trial became a highly publicized event, with Kelsie's family attending every day in hopes of finally finding out what had happened to her. In February of 2016, a major development occurred when Santana's trial came to an unexpected halt. The charges against him were dropped due to a lack of sufficient evidence to proceed. This decision was a devastating blow to Kelsie's family and all those who had been hoping for justice. Despite the arrest and initial charges, the case was far from over. Santana's freedom did not bring an end to the search for answers, and investigators continued to work tirelessly to uncover the truth. Even after the trial ended without a conviction, Kelsie's family refused to give up. The lack of closure was agonizing, but they continued to press law enforcement for more answers. Throughout this time, Kelsie's case remained unsolved, and the community around Pueblo continued to be haunted by the mystery of her disappearance. Kelsie's family, undeterred by the setbacks, kept searching for new leads and supporting other missing persons cases in the hope that one day they would find justice. In the years that followed, the case of Kelsie Schelling has not been forgotten. Law enforcement continues to revisit the evidence, hoping that new forensic technology or fresh tips will help solve the case. As of 2023, Kelsie's case remains open, and her family continues to fight for the truth, pushing for renewed attention and investigation into what really happened to her. Kelsie's story is a reminder of the thousands of people who go missing every year and whose families never stop seeking justice. Her case, marked by unanswered questions and a constant search for closure, serves as a testament to the resilience of her loved ones. Despite the pain and frustration, Kelsie's family has never given up hope, and they continue to call for justice in their daughter's memory. The fight for answers in Kelsie Schelling's case may not be over, but her family's determination and love continue to shine as a beacon of hope for all those seeking justice for missing loved ones.